Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Wing Commander Shane Rutherford, who is an officer in the UK Royal Air Force. He has flown combat missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Recently, he completed the U.S. Joint Forces Staff College in the Joint Advanced Warfighting School, or JAWS. Shane Rutherford, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hi, John. Excited and looking forward to talking with you. Thanks.
Yeah, likewise. And before we begin, I would just like to inform our audience that Wing Commander Rutherford's opinions and comments are his own and do not reflect the opinions or the policies of the UK Ministry of Defense or the Royal Air Force. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Shane, will cover your JAWS thesis, which is entitled Back to the Future, Political Paralysis Cost Britain America. What will it cost the United States? But before we get into your thesis and this topic, which is really interesting, by the way, could we start off, Shane, by getting your overall comment about our strategic landscape and the times in which we live?
Yes, so I'll start by saying, when I say we, I generally mean the West, but particularly the United States and Britain. But obviously the paper is heavily focused on the United States because I was on the United States defense course. But essentially, I think the strategic landscape right now, and we were discussing this briefly before we started recording, is essentially, for the first time in most people's lifetime, they're observing and experiencing a change in the international order, world order of things. And then previously, when world order is set or established, its longevity is defined by the structural factors and evolutionary capacity to anticipate strategic shocks and known elements that alter the strategic environment, and the system's ability to absorb the inevitable and inherent unknown strategic shocks that occur as part of that reality and the consequence of the unique system that's been built. Right now, we are in a epochal change to the global world order, and the United States is going to have to adapt and accommodate or change the way they're doing things in order to retain their position on top of that. So I think that's the sort of overarching summary of where we're at. I think there's some differences in what we've seen before, largely due to things like social media. But also I think there are other differences in the pillars of the instruments of power, in that you might end up in a situation where different countries have the hegemony in different elements of national power. For example, China may well end up as the economic leader of the world order, but the US will retain its position as the military leader of the world order, for example. And I think that's the difference. But ultimately, that's where I think we're at right now.
Okay, yeah, great perspective there. So as I mentioned at the top, our topic today is going to be your thesis. And by the way, to our audience, we will have a link in the show notes so that you can access this thesis and check it out if you like. But again, the title is a play on words, Back to the Future, Political Paralysis Cost Britain America. What will it cost the United States? Why did you choose to write on this topic?
So I fell into the Revolutionary War elective at JAWS. The reason I fell into that was largely because I thought the professor that teaches it is a pretty inspirational guy.
Who is the professor?
Professor Craig Bruce Smith.
Okay. And also, where is this school located for those in our audience who may not know?
Yeah, it's in Norfolk in Virginia.
Okay.
So large naval base there with the fleet, and it's a school. Yeah, it's a school just behind the NATO facility, actually.
Right, which also offers the possibility of walking some Revolutionary War battlegrounds too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I've frequented Yorktown's grounds actually more than the British did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
During the American Revolution.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the professor, inspirational guy, and I thought, I've studied World War II before. I've studied other things before. I felt like the course was going to teach us a lot about China anyway, because obviously it's the greatest pacing challenge right now. So I decided to go throw myself into something new and study something that isn't taught necessarily in the United Kingdom unless you search for it, and learn something different. Now, the challenge then, though, was once I fell into that elective, was I really wanted to write something contemporary, something that had meaning for today's military strategists, and particularly myself, and to help us through some of the complications and the challenges that we face as developing senior military leaders, about how to pivot our organizations to respond to these sorts of challenges and the things that affect them that are outside of our purview or control. And that's where I started to identify in the American Revolution these elements of politics that affect military strategy that are more consequential than perhaps the decisions that individual military commanders made during the American Revolutionary War. And I think that was the inspiration, was how do I bridge something? How do I connect something from the 1770s to today? And that was a challenge, but hopefully I achieved it. And I think there are some real fascinating comparisons and conclusions that can be drawn. Like we discussed earlier, it's not a direct parallel. It's not a direct comparison. It's just a unique vehicle and tool to assess what can happen in the similar sets of circumstances that we're seeing today. And we've seen it before, not just in Britain or in the colonies, but we also saw it in other areas as well.
I see. Could you give our audience an idea of what was the story on the British side in the late 1700s that you're wanting to compare to today's some of today's dynamics? Tell that story, especially for people in our audience who might not be as familiar with the perspective from which you're going to tell the story.
Yeah, so there are actually a number of pillars that I identified, and then I tried to focus on certain aspects of them, from leadership to weaponization of the economy, for example. So the British experienced a period of relative stability. I don't want to get into the the pros and cons of certain individual leaders, but we had what was known as our first prime minister, in inverted commas, Sir Robert Walpole. He oversaw or presided a period of unity as the British Parliament began its transition, or continued its transition away from or into the constitutional monarchy system. And during that period of stability, we navigated some the South is known as the South Sea Bubble, basically a financial crisis similar to 2008. We were able to navigate those sorts of strategic shocks I talked about earlier, with how the strategic landscape looks. So we were able to do that, I found, because through this idea of collective responsibility and strategic leadership, the ability to unite, the ability to recognize what's more significant for the country rather than the individual. And I think, don't get me wrong, as I said, I don't want to get into the depths of of whether or not Walpole himself was a great leader or not, but ultimately the facts speak for themselves, that he was able to navigate the country through periods of huge strategic change. And it was actually one of the first prime ministers to ever retain his seat in power as we transitioned from one king to another, in King George I and the Second.
Right. So, and this time period would say early to mid 1700s.
That's right.
Right now. Okay. Yeah.
Then he resigns because of so because of factors actually of his leadership, but other things that conspired against him. And ultimately, what then happens is this period of tumultuousness in British politics, where we're now with King George II. He has previously followed the line of King George I in terms of his focus is on continental Europe, the Habsburg lineage, and all of a sudden he realizes there's this change in the British system and British politicians increasing in power, and he's concerned for, obviously his seat. So he starts to interfere, starts to involve himself, and tries to influence politics. And what happens is those that do have that level of influence with royalty, they end up becoming basically more influential, more powerful within the system. But actually what takes hold is this idea of individuality, greed. There's also a bit of complacency setting in because of rapid growth since our commitment to blue water policy. So we see this sensational, if you like, consequence of individuality, where people exchange political progression and the benefit of the country for their individual needs. And I'll give you an example where Townsend, who was making foreign policy decisions because of certain investments that he had made in certain companies at the time, rather than decisions that would benefit the country. And these things sort of erode, and they become toxic, and they change the system. Then what happens is British complacency, particularly toward the colonies, great complacency towards the colonies, was seen as a peripheral issue. No net assessment was ever conducted in the colonies about the value of the United States to the British Empire. And I'll give you I know I'm rambling a bit, but give you an example.
No, this is great. No, yeah, good background. Yeah,
the stamp duty tax that ignited the tinderbox of revolution, that wasn't even debated in Parliament, because the politicians were so busy jockeying and trying to position themselves in favor with royalty or with commercial interests. You have such a cataclysmic foreign policy decision that's not even debated in the House. It's just passed. And the reason it was passed is because of this idea of paralysis, the polarization ideology, the inability to properly debate things. And also, I have to say, there's also this overarching concept of wrapping your entire foreign policy narrative in a common cause threat. And for us at the time, that was France. So unless we had the French to focus our bipartisanship, we were unable to communicate and come together. And the fact that they weren't able to identify the strategic value of the United States colonies at the time, but then further westward over time, is a consequence of the sorts of failures I talk about in the paper from political perspective. And then also there are some synonymous behaviors, such as the weaponization of the economy I talked about, where this is what you see in particularly in democracies, is when politicians aren't communicating or can't solve things or don't debate things properly, they go for the easy option. And weaponizing the economy, albeit very differently then to how it's done now, is ultimately a consequence largely of the fact that things can't be debated properly. So they exchange what's easy, and weaponizing the economy is an easy way out in terms of managing your international relationships.
Right. Well, and then in addition to that, I'm hearing identifying an other to focus your collective attention on as well. In this case, France, right? If British politicians could be sure to talk about the worries, the national worries relative to France, then that is also a way of distracting and ultimately causing this political paralysis as well.
Exactly. And I think, that's something that's really relative and poignant for today's strategic environment.
Mm-hmm.
The period up to 1989 of this bipolar world was actually a fallacy. The United States had the upper hand. We didn't know that we did, but the entire time the United States was going to be the winner. With the hindsight, we know that. We didn't know it at the time. But that situation, that bipolar situation, is very similar to what Britain faced with France. And so you end up becoming focused on that. And I think that's why China today, for the United States, many people are trying to latch on to China. Like, let's make China our sole problem that we can unite our foreign policy objectives over. But actually, China is just one element of a vast array of different problems. And I think that because of the nature of politics at the moment, we are missing a trick by trying to focus all our activities in one area. And the British example with France, and then not being able to look at the strategic value of the United States, is a classic comparison to go back and look at. Look what happens when you do that. And we ended up losing America as a result. And that's where I cut. It's one of the aspects of me saying, what does America stand to lose if they continue to only be able to? It's a bit unfair, not only be able to, but try to wrap everything in a China problem, which is not the way we should go about how we conduct our foreign policy.
Well, so if relating the past to the present now, so if Britain was like self-distracting itself, that's an awkward way of saying it, but if Britain was distracting itself with France as a boogeyman, and to the cost of losing the colonies, what are those dynamics that you're seeing today? So you've got the United States potentially distracting itself with China, but what would be America's to lose in your scenario?
Yeah, so I think don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we should have we should have discounted France and said we need to make
no, yeah,
French.
right, yeah.
What I'm saying is that's your pacing challenge, right? France is your absolutely. France is your pacing challenge, but you have to be able to. If politics is paralyzed in the nature that it was in Britain, you're not able to conduct the things I described, like the net assessments of the value of the other strategic factors in the system that's going on around you. And I think that's the danger, is that and that's the danger for the United States moving forward, is we can't just wrap everything around China as the pacing challenge, and then everything else must fall out as a consequence. And a classic example would be, my argument is that what's going to be the more immediate challenge for the United States is probably going to be the Sahel in Central Africa. That area is going to need the United States leadership as a consequence of all sorts of crises, from migration to climate change, whether that's climate induced migration or otherwise.
Sure.
So I think that's going to be the region which is going to dominate more immediately our attention. And I think that we should be looking at our global resources, and our politicians should be looking at how the right level of leadership in those areas and how we can apply our resources more effectively might prevent a disaster, or might prevent us from having to engage in a disaster which will distract us from other things, such as how to deal with the pacing challenge of China. And I think like we said earlier, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. China is not the same pacing challenge to the United States as France was to Britain.
Mm-hmm.
It was the French domination of the continent that was concerned, based on and also the factor of our Habsburg lineage, the German lineage, that we of our kingship. That connection is much different to what we're experiencing now. And actually, China's rise, it's more in other elements of instruments of power. I think militarily, the United States would absolutely dominate them if it came, God forbid, it came to some sort of military engagement. Maybe not in their backyard, but certainly globally. But what's going to be the influence of their economic hegemony if it continues to trend in that trajectory, which is what we're seeing? That is going to be a challenge, and I think that we have to be able to recognize what the pacing challenge is, recognize how that pacing challenge impacts other areas of our strategic environment. Then we need to be able to assess through things like net assessments about what things are going on strategically, and then look at our global resources and our global initiatives to look at how we better position ourselves to respond to that. And I think that integrated deterrence, a military initiative, is the right sort of strategic approach to deal with this. But I would contend, from my experience over the past year, that the military, they fully understand. They seem to fully understand what integrated deterrence means. But to deal with China, as I just described, we need all of our economic instruments of power, our diplomatic instruments of power, to be aligned with the integrated deterrence concept if we are going to shape China in the way we want to shape them in order to retain the United States position in charge of the world order. Those things we are not synchronized across those instruments of power. And I think that that's another consequence of the fact that we're spending too long political infighting. We're not debating the things that we need to be debating. We're not moving forward because of commercial interests, greed, and other factors that shape the way our international system works.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so when you say that we are not integrated, do you mean the United States, or the Five Eye partnership, or NATO, or like all of the above?
So I think that actually, when you look at NATO and the military partnerships of the Five Eye community in particular, but I would say the US and the UK, we are incredibly integrated and synchronized. US and UK could go anywhere and operate together anytime, any place, right now, seamlessly. And Australia is increasingly becoming part of that community. So I'd say the three of us. So when I talk about the integration, what I mean is it's the other levers of the instruments of power that are non-aligned. And I'm not suggesting for one second that the military owns responsibility, or the military is the lead for synchronizing these efforts. Actually, I would contend that in many cases they're not, particularly when it comes to China. So what I'm saying is what we tend to see is a misalignment of activity. So the military will be approaching China from an integrated deterrence perspective, forming relationships, as my good friend Dr. Forney would say. We're trying to set up a situation where we can get places ready to fight quickly with all our friends. We're pretty good at that in the military. But then we see things diplomatically or economically, in economic forums or other forums, where those efforts are undermined, particularly in the Far East, where we see diplomatic and economic activity that undermines the military's efforts to form the bonds and partnerships with certain countries that are required to respond to a military problem if it occurs in the South China Sea. And I think that's the issue. And I believe that the reason for that is because our politics is paralyzed from being able to get at those debates and trying to align our system. They're paralyzed from being able to catalyze the institutional change that's required to deal with the world order as it's evolving now.
Right. Well, so what are some of the top line recommendations that you have to leaders? And so what would you recommend to try to mitigate these risks?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, I mean, in the paper there are some recommendations that I agree that I put in there about things like the debt ceiling. That's an internal issue. I won't go into that because really I feel a little bit uncomfortable doing that from a British perspective.
Sure.
But Ezra Klein, who wrote a book called Why We're Polarized, he talks about a lot of these things, the internal things that can be done. But I think internationally, we needed Goldwater-Nichols Act. Now, for those who don't know, that was a structural reform to the military a few decades ago that came up with the Joint Chief of Staff system and the way that the organization organizes, trains, and equips, and the way the way the military is structured and does things. That was, I think, anybody would say that was a positive and resulted in great things for the US military. I think we require one of those now, one of those Goldwater-Nichols types acts to come in and look at the difference in the strategic environment we discussed at the start. What is the difference, and what is required to maintain our position as the leader of democratic free world? What is required across using all of our instruments of power to maintain that position? That's the thing that needs to happen next, and that's the way we're going to respond to particularly the China pacing challenge.
I see. And you talked about integrated deterrence a few moments ago. Do you generally believe that the integrated deterrence framework, like that as like an overarching concept or mindset, is a good way to approach the problem?
Yeah, so it's interesting because integrated deterrence is an approach, not a way, right? And it's an approach that if you got that's your approach, it's your benchmark. But then, as we described earlier, with the value of the net assessment, integrated deterrence is your benchmark, but there's not a one size fits all because the problems are multifaceted. So to answer your question, yes, I think integrated deterrence could be a really valuable approach. And I think the way the military, particularly Indo-PACOM, approaches the application of integrated deterrence is pretty good. But if we pivot to the Russia problem and what's going on in Ukraine, to give you an example of the problems you face, is that the Russian war in Ukraine, from a Russian perspective, was largely caused by things that the European Union was doing, not necessarily just what NATO was doing. So, and that's to do with like the economic situation, but also color revolutions. So that from the Russian perspective, that's how they see the reasons for why they invade Ukraine. Now, we don't have control over that, but if we're more integrated, it means that when we're in our forums, whether it be NATO or whether the Americans are observing European Union activity, if we are more integrated, we can recognize the issues with, let's say, trying to integrate Ukraine more into the European Union markets, the dangers the consequences, if you like, of those decisions. I don't think we're aligned in that way. So I think there are really good examples of how the military is approaching integrated deterrence, and I think that yes, the military could lead on perhaps integrate the integration aspects, the leadership of integrating the other instruments of power, but actually what I would see in the future is those other instruments of national power being the lead agent in in how to apply integrated deterrence. But it's not you can't have a one size fits all. And this is the issue with going back to 1989 and earlier, because containment was so successful. And I'm inverted commas again.
Yeah.
Because it was so successful, the United States was able to pursue liberal democracy freely for decades as a consequence of the containment policy. So that it tends to be that we go, right, well, we need a one-size-fits-all policy again then, because that one worked great for us. That's not how the strategic environment looks today. So yes, going back to the original question, integrated deterrence is a great approach, a benchmark approach, but actually that's how it starts. But there are many different factors and facets dependent on what part of the strategic landscape you're looking at.
Right. And as you mentioned several times, the military has a role, for sure. But it's not just a military program. And back to the title of your thesis, political paralysis, right there in the word, or in that phrase, suggests that there are players involved that do not include the military. And so, human nature is fixed for, basically for the purposes of this discussion, right? The same kinds of people who were politicians in Britain in the 1700s are not terribly different from the kinds of people who are politicians today, and not just in America, but globally. Politicians have a way of looking at the world that is different from business people, from military people, from diplomats, right? Politicians have their own way of engaging with the world, and somehow, so I guess long clumsy lead up to what are the kinds of things that you would suggest to politicians, assuming they would listen, in order to for them to more productively engage in this problem set.
And I completely agree with everything you just said. In the paper, I talk about things like, in establishing the 118th Congress, we saw this, what President Biden's own words were, this embarrassment in process for electing a speaker. Mm-hmm. And then the follow-on implications of that for a country like the United States, in that because we were unable to select a speaker, the committees that are responsible for debate and for pivoting and directing the country's response to what's going on in the strategic landscape weren't able to form because the speaker hadn't been set. And that delay, the weeks in delay, can the United States take 4 weeks off or 2 weeks off, or where these committees, perhaps the old ones are still working, but we all know what's going to happen when Congress switches the majority, and different committees have different side of the house as the head of the committee. The things are going to change, right? They're going to roll back on some things, they might continue others, but basically that's an example of the paralysis in politics these days that ultimately would have led to a situation where things weren't being done because we were too busy doing this. So I think there's a responsibility. When Thomas Hobbes came up with this idea of the social contract, there's a responsibility there for politicians to be able to put to one side their personal inclinations, their whatever it is, whether it's commercial interests, or to recognize the responsibility of the position that you've been given. But equally, I would say there's a responsibility for the individuals, for the population. We need to get far better at engaging in politics than we do. I include myself in that statement, particularly at the local level. We tend to focus on the national level, but actually there are many tiers of the political system that we should be actively, that's the whole purpose of the social contract, is there are two sides to it, and they have equal responsibility for engagement in order to make sure that the system works. So it's not just all the politicians' fault. It's our fault too. And we need to get far better at accountability of ourselves and politicians, but also engagement. So what I would say is, I say in the paper that in a crisis, leaders tend to emerge. We might not, depending on your assessment, might not be in a crisis right now, but America has generated some pretty good leaders over its history. And right now, leadership is required, responsibility is required. And I think, to his credit, I think that, and we won't get into a political discussion, but I do think there are elements of President Biden's leadership which are exactly what is required. And perhaps we'll see more of that moving forward, hopefully, if we're optimistic.
Right. And yeah, I think that we can probably leave off right there. If I could just mention a previous episode that we had, that what you were just saying reminded me of this. So we had a great discussion with a guy named Joseph Lee, and he is a Jungian analyst. Right. And one of the things that he discussed in his episode was, based upon the soup, the times that we live in, it creates the conditions for certain phenomenon to emerge. Exactly. And the example that he gave was World War II in Germany, the rise of Hitler, and he called it I think he called it the mana archetype. Yeah. I might not have that exactly right, but based upon the dynamics within Europe at the time, and I can't recap it all, but that's set the fertile soil for a person like Hitler to emerge and somehow embody the times yes. in his being. And yes. So what you were just describing, maybe the dynamics that we're experiencing globally within Britain, within the U.S., is going to be setting the stage for something to emerge, which harnesses the energy of these times. And
that's absolutely right.
And I don't know what that will be. I mean, it could be good, it could be something other than good, but the same kind of thing, I think, is what you were describing as well.
That's it. It's a really good point. I think in Ben Rhodes' book, After the Fall, where he talks about authoritarianism, he describes that exact phenomenon, that would we recognize Hitler right now in our midst? To use your example, or would we recognize someone of that ilk right now in our midst as they jockey and position themselves for power? And I think that's the danger. That's that we don't know what it is, but we need to recognize that could, something as terrible as that could end up being the consequence.
Right. Or on the other side of the coin, it could be that somebody emerges that is a I don't know, virtuous figure who
Lincoln
Lincoln rises,
emerges, right?
Yeah. rises to the occasion is just the right person to help tackle what needs to be done.
Absolutely.
Fascinating stuff, Shane. Great paper. I encourage our audience to check it out. And maybe we can close things out with a quick lightning round. And
Colonel Vic Norris, he told me, he said, look forward to the lightning round. So,
the lightning round. Yeah, here we go. So 30 seconds to 1 minute per question, something like that.
Okay.
All right. So first lightning round. Strategic complacency.
Yes. So, as in, you want? What do I think about that?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. What's your hot take on strategic complacency?
Strategic complacency is is another consequence of the things I'm talking about. So with Britain's example, strategic complacency with the colonies, tertiary interest, or perceived to be a tertiary interest, catastrophic failure because of the strategic advantage that would have been gained. And equally now, I think having had decades of the pursuit of liberal democracy, largely unchallenged militarily, you run the risk of assuming that we're always going to win.
Right. So I was going to give you a lightning round on, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. But
Yeah.
you already mentioned that. But
Yeah.
So instead, we talked about this before we recorded, but there's a great quote from Vladimir Lenin that I'd like to get your hot take on. And the quote from Lenin is, "There are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen."
Absolutely. I think that when we reflect on this period, we might well see that as 100% accurate. We've been fortunate enough certainly in our lifetimes to live in a period of dominance from the United States, which has set an international order that has been absolutely in our favor. And right now we are experiencing massive strategic tectonic change to the way the strategic landscape looks. And I think we might reflect on it in a few years and say, wow, how did that all happen in that relative short period of time?
Yep. And then the last lightning round, and this is a deep cut here. So a deep cultural cut.
Yeah.
The flux capacitor.
Yeah. So I'm going to take that. I took that as the impact of technology, perhaps. Okay. And I think when we look at the competition between China and the United States and technology, particularly anything related to the AI landscape, which is obviously a hot topic at the moment. But I think both sides are looking for the flux capacitor element of the AI world that gives them strategic overmatch.
Okay.
And the danger is who gets it. We need the United States to get that first. They need to be the one with the flux capacitor, because the world changes if much more rapidly if we're not.
Okay. So I'm not sure whether you map this over into the title of your thesis. So the title of your thesis was Back to the Future.
Yes.
Right. And so that was a movie in the 1980s, right?
Yes.
And in that movie, they use the flux capacitor to go back in time.
Yeah.
So the flux capacitor was the device that was installed in the 1985 whatever DeLorean
in the car. Yeah.
In order to go back to back in time and back to the future. So,
I perhaps I interpreted that part of the strategic around the wrong way.
But I agree with what you're saying, though. There is a technology or a device or something that we want to harness. Before.
And I think to go more along the lines of the movie, we always need to look to history. As Thucydides taught us, there are many things that that have happened before that will happen again. We need to look back at the things that have happened before, take what we can from those, recognize that the current situation is obviously different, and then respond accordingly. And history is the key element to that, which is why President Biden so consistently refers for people to look back at the origins of this wonderful country, because that's the element that unites it. The elements that were forged in revolution.
Excellent. Well, fantastic study. I encourage listeners to go and check it out for themselves. And with that, Shane Rutherford, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.